Okay, we're going to try to get back going here. 10 minutes goes fast. But, of course, we're a little more informal, so if you still have things you need to do, going to the restroom, getting the things wrapped up, that's absolutely fine. Let's do it. Okay, so I'm gonna give a little bit on. We're just. There we go. We're gonna start. So we did history, and then Jeff's gonna do a little bit on Constitution here tonight as well, which is good. And I'm going to talk about the Bible, and specifically what I want to talk about, and I want to connect with you about this evening. I'm not gonna teach on the Bible per se tonight, but what I want to talk about is the nature of worldviews. Why a worldview matters and why worldviews matter. Sam brought it up a little bit, and the idea of a worldview as it relates to the writing of history. So let's get a little interactive here for just a moment. If I were to ask you what a worldview is, who could describe to me in simple terms, what is a worldview? Jeff. Good. And anything else? Anyone want to add anything as it relates to a worldview? Okay. What do you think truth is? Good. Or do you even think there's such thing, right? Okay. Yeah. And so and those things all filter through the idea of a worldview. So when we ask the question, what is a worldview? It consists of our most basic beliefs, and then here, notice this, assumptions about reality. We might call them our presuppositions, the foundation upon which we build. The foundation of everyone's thinking are actually assumptions, unprovable assumptions as it relates to the things that are around us. Everyone makes these assumptions, but very few people realize they have them. You have assumptions about why you're here, where you came from, where you're going. And there are elements of that which remain unprovable. We can call it faith. We can call it whatever you want to call it. But at the foundation of those things, even for those that have what we would consider to be a fully materialistic worldview, that we've just evolved, and that we came out of primordial soup as single-celled organisms, and then as single-celled organisms, we thus evolved into complex organisms. Even for those that would believe that, at some point it comes down to fundamental, as a matter of fact, a lot of those are assumptions, right? Because nobody was there to see it. And nobody was there to record it, which means we are dealing with fundamental assumptions about how the world works. These fundamental presuppositions, without these, nothing makes sense. So Richard mentioned the idea of truth. One of the things that we're running into in our age today is not just the question about what is the truth, but can you even have truth, right? Can you even have truth? And the questioning of the existence of truth itself has a place that it came from. It didn't just, our young people aren't pulling that out of thin air, right? Well, we don't even know if truth exists. No, there are fundamental reasons why our young people are in a place, particularly young people, are in a place where there is a crisis of whether or not they even believe truth exists. And of course, then this branches off into, if there is no truth, then what does that mean about everything, right? What does that mean about governments? What does that mean about institutions? What does that mean about authority? What does that mean about male and female if truth doesn't exist? And so when we think about the nature of how we're interacting with people, it's very important that we begin with this concept of worldviews, understanding our worldviews. These presuppositions of the worldview, many people describe it like glasses. And a worldview would be the glasses through which you see the world. If I were to put on blue-tinted glasses, everything in the world would look blue. If I were to put on red-tinted glasses, everything in the world would look red. As Sam talked about history, people write with tinted glasses, right? Whether you want to talk about conservative authors or liberal authors or whatever it might be, people have if they have an objective as it relates to how they study history, we're looking for patriotism in history, or we're looking for the reasons that history was, the reasons that America's evil, right? We come into our study of history with the tint on our glasses of America is this perfectly patriotic place, and we are, the anointing of God was of such that there was no wrong, no evil, no whatever it might be. And then on the other end, you have the concept that we're just a bunch of white colonizers, right, who came to America specifically to perpetuate whiteness. And both of those are there with a tint, with a worldview, presuppositions that undergird how you're interpreting the facts. And that's the idea. We are given facts in life. But facts oftentimes don't speak for themselves. Facts have to be, or should I say evidences. Evidences don't often speak for themselves. They have to be interpreted. And how we interpret that evidence is going to color our conclusions. And this is the idea of worldviews. So I want to introduce you to 4 primary general categories of worldviews that we find throughout history. And the first is this idea of monotheism, the idea of one infinite God. And under that are 3 very different worldviews: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They're all monotheistic religions. They are all very different in their worldview, but they come from the same idea of a single infinite God. Then you have the idea of pantheism, that only the spiritual dimension exists, that everything in this world is actually connected to the spiritual. Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, New Age consciousness. These are all pantheistic worldviews, and the nature of them as pantheistic worldviews, believing that only the spiritual exists, that matter is an illusion, that everything here is an illusion, that colors the way they see the world. Then polytheism. Polytheism is a system of multiple gods, and typically speaking, these multiple gods will interact with the world in such a way that you please the gods and certain things happen, and you displease the gods and other things happen. And spiritism, animism, witchcraft, these are all different polytheistic religions. Of course, you can also find polytheism there's thousands of polytheistic religions in various cultures around the world. And then you have humanism. And humanism believes, unlike pantheism, which only the spiritual exists, humanism says only the material universe exists, that there is no spiritual dimension. Atheism, naturalism, Satanism actually is very humanistic. Marxism, postmodernism. And each one of these subsets is also a worldview under the subset of these 4 general categories of worldviews. And so you can imagine that as you're interacting with people at any given time on any given subject, you're dealing with a great number of possibilities as to how a person views the world that is around them. And this is important in several ways. The way that the world is attempting to present this today is that the importance of understanding worldviews is for diversity and inclusion, right? And the idea behind diversity and inclusion is that we have to acknowledge everyone's worldview and allow each person to believe what they believe and to believe that it's right and nobody's wrong and everybody just has an opinion. Well, we know that's not true, right? That can't be true. Everyone can't be right. If I make a truth claim and someone else makes the opposite truth claim, we can't both be right. But it does help us understand how it is we engage with people as it relates to truth. See, it used to be, especially, and I can relate this to a church context, it used to be that I could go out. We have in the back of our church a bunch of gospel tracts. Our church encourages the handing out of those tracts and letting people know about the gospel. It used to be that you could give very little information about what is coined the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? And you could assume that the worldview undergirding most of the people was such, they probably went to church as kids, they probably heard the Bible stories, they probably have enough there that you could give a relatively small amount of information to guide their thinking as it relates to the Bible into the tract of what the Bible actually says, and they would come to some measure of conclusion that would be accurate and bring them to understanding. We can't assume that anymore. We can't assume that people are growing up in churches and that they have these foundations. You cannot assume that our young people have any sort of a foundation that will allow them to understand the founding documents. The idea that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, you cannot assume that there is any basis in anyone's thinking today to understand why that matters or why that's even correct. We contend for the founding as if we are contending for something that everyone wants, and they should want it. But half of this country doesn't understand why those words are relevant, matter, or why that is best. Because a good deal of this country does not relate themselves to personal responsibility, individual liberty, in the way that we do. And the way that we relate ourselves, and this is the point of the Wright County Restoration Project, is inextricably tied to the Bible, to a mindset that has flowed from the Bible. The mindset of the founders was a biblical mindset. Now, they weren't all Christians. But the mindset of that culture was unified and biblical. They shared a similar worldview. They had a lot of disagreements, but they shared a worldview. And so what they were disagreeing about was the top level stuff. Was the nitty-gritty, was application, was how that worked out, was how you go about making this thing work. But there weren't really questions about we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. That's not the case anymore. We are fighting a worldview battle, and we need to understand that. Because if we spend all of our time fighting the top-level stuff, and we've seen this. You saw this for the 4 years of President Trump. And now we're seeing it with President Biden. We spent our 4 years shoving our worldview down the throats of the country, getting what we wanted to get done, while on the other side calling us evil. And now they get their 4 years to shove their worldview down our throats, while we call them evil. And we are in a fundamental battle, a disagreement. And as I said before, we're not even living in the same realities anymore. And the question is, can we help people understand that? And then can we contend together for a similar worldview, or understand that if we cannot come to a similar worldview, that there's no way that we can maintain a government where we're trying to shove each other's worldviews down each other's throats. So each worldview and the subset worldviews interprets the world through the lens of their presuppositions and truth claims. If you believe that everything in the world is spiritual and that matter is just illusion, then that's going to change the way you look at the world, right? If you believe that there's only matter and that there's nothing spiritual, that's really going to change the way you look at the world. Even among shared broader worldviews, as I've said, Christianity and Islam are both monotheistic, there's tremendous disparities. And all worldviews operate to the exclusion of the other worldviews, regardless of how inclusive or tolerant we can be of one another. But my worldview fundamentally shapes how I see the world. Now, the United States was founded upon a biblical worldview. Its founding documents, its philosophy, its laws were designed and governed by a people who agreed on the biblical worldview. Again, now, if you look into history, we can actually pare this down even more. The United States was actually founded on a Protestant worldview. I'm not trying to offend any of the Catholics in here, but it was a Protestant nation. As a matter of fact, at the time of the founding, Catholicism was illegal in a large portion of the country, as it was in the United Kingdom at the time. And so, and this is actually why, I mean, as you trace history, it's a really fascinating thing. This is why the Catholics initially threw themselves in with the Democrat Party, because the Whig Party, which then became the Republican Party, was so deeply Protestant, and the Catholics were trying to strip a little bit of that deeply Protestant, particularly certain elements of Protestantism, they were trying to wrest some of the power away, and they were not going to do it in the Whig Party or the Republican Party, so they had to do it in the Democrat Party. And again, the Democrats of that day were very different than the Democrats of today, so I'm not trying to paint those. But we do find that there's a lot there, but as you go back in history, the governing philosophy, founding principles, and laws of this country were primarily Protestant and more broadly biblical in worldview. Now, if we think about these two different worldviews, and I'm going to pare it down to two, and I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but the basic tenets of a biblical worldview. So if we go back, taking out the Protestant layer and going back to the biblical layer, as it relates to matter, God is the creator and the authority of the universe. Matter is real. Matter is good. Matter exists to glorify God. We do not believe, as many of the pantheistic religions do, that matter is in and of itself evil. That the things around us are intrinsically evil. Matter is fine. Matter is good. Matter was created by God, but God is the authority over all that is created. And we see that in the Declaration of Independence. On humans, we bear the image of God. And because we bear the image of God, we have a natural human dignity and God-given rights that are conferred upon us by the fact that we are made in the image of God. This comes up deeply in the founding principles. Man is created to have a personal relationship with God. That's a part of the biblical worldview. On death, man is eternal. He exists beyond just death. Death is not the end. Death is a step in the process of eternity. Dependent upon his choice in this life, mankind will either spend eternity with God or eternity in judgment. This was a part of that biblical worldview. How about reality? God has given man intelligence and he expects man to use it. The majority of the scientific discovery of the centuries was actually rooted in this idea, going all the way back to the Old Testament, that God has given man intellect. And because God has given man intellect, we ought to take the fact that the world is created, thus orderly, and the fact that God has given us intellect and made us creative beings, and merge those to understand the order that God has created, and then to capitalize on that order and harness it for man's best good. This is a Christian principle, a biblical principle. The world has been given to man for stewardship and for dominion. And so we have the right to use the resources of earth. We also have a stewardship over earth so that we need to be good stewards and careful with the earth. These are Christian principles. God has given man direct, divine, and perfect revelation through the Bible in order to relate himself to God, and that means that God has given us an authoritative book. And if God has given us an authoritative book, then we are accountable to that book. And this is a biblical worldview. On morality, God is perfectly good. He has created in humans the same qualities of moral goodness that are in himself, but mankind's moral nature, I put moral natural there, my apologies for the typo, man's moral nature has been corrupted by sin. And see, this is another very big one as it relates to today's conflicts. The Bible says man is naturally sinful and predisposed to evil. And because we're naturally sinful and predisposed for evil, first, of course, and primary, we need redemption through Jesus Christ. That's what the Bible teaches. That's what the biblical worldview undergirds. That I cannot save myself, that I cannot get myself right with God, that I cannot be morally good enough for God, but I need Christ to do that for me. But in a political layer, the layer that is added politically is that man is prone to corruption. So we must add layers, checks and balances in place to keep man away from power, because power corrupts. And power always will. That is a biblical idea. And that is a Christian principle. So, think through this with me, and we're not quite done yet. Well, let's talk about history here. History is God's story. His story, right? History. God made himself known in history through his actions. History has a beginning and history has an end, which means we're working toward an end, right? This doesn't have to go on forever. There is an end in sight. And of course, at the end of that is either glory or judgment in the biblical worldview. Now, If you think of all of that and all of the things I just told you, we're going to draw the connections to the founding here in a little bit, and I won't be able to get through all of it. We'll continue it next time. But now imagine if you don't believe the Bible. What if you grew up in a system that teaches you naturalistically that man is not prone to evil but prone to good? Man is naturally good. That if you follow your heart, it will turn out. That man has a nature in him that is predisposed to goodness. Maybe some of you believe that. That's not what the Bible teaches. Now we can have the debate about whether or not the Bible is true or false, but the Bible does not teach that. The Bible teaches all men are sinners, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. There's none righteous, no, not one. There's none that doeth good. There's none that seeketh after God. That's what the Bible says. So if I grow up saying man is predisposed to goodness, and then all of a sudden I see these people in government, and these people are talking about how they just want the good of everyone, and I say, why can't I just give them the power they need to bring about all this good stuff? And it doesn't once occur to me, what are they going to do when they get that power? It doesn't, because man is naturally good. Man is prone to goodness. And these people, they have their money and they have their education, so there's no reason why they should be bad. And we're tending toward goodness, right? And that is a different worldview. So the history of the United States is a people who shared a common biblical worldview, but they disagreed on the nuances. Right? Adams and Jefferson and whatnot, they disagreed on how things should come about. And of course, Jefferson was a pretty unique guy as it relates to his religious views, as you know. But he regarded that at least the simplicity of the biblical worldview. The disagreements between parties stemmed from disagreements on how society should relate itself to those truths that they agreed upon. This all the catalyst or the end of this change was World War II. It really was changing all throughout World War I, World War II. If you've ever read C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity was a set of radio lectures that C.S. Lewis gave between World War I and World War II, contending for the biblical worldview, because at the end of World War I, Europe was post-Christian. And they had given up entirely, really. And that was working its way to the United States. And by the end of World War II, the United States was working towards post-Christianity as well. And in World War II, and we're going to get into the history of this in another day. As we get into World War II, there's a solidification of something that began in the 19th century. And that would have been in the mid to late 1800s, right? Is the 19th century. And then into the early 20th century. And these changes, there was an erosion of biblical thinking. And that erosion came through what I call three primary prophets of humanism that began to detach the American mind from the biblical worldview. First was Charles Darwin with the philosophies and ideas of Darwinian evolution. Now again, agree with him or disagree with him, one cannot but understand how that would detach the mind from a creator God. Second was Karl Marx. So Charles Darwin, okay, so I don't know where you do all your deep thinking. I do all my deep thinking in the shower. And when you're in the shower and that water's pouring over you and you're doing your deep thinking, right? The questions that naturally come to the mind, the human mind, in those times of deep thinking: where have I come from? Where am I going? What do I do with myself? What's my purpose? Where have I come from? Where am I going? What's my purpose? Right? Charles Darwin answered the question humanistically, outside of God, detached from God. Where have I come from? Karl Marx gives humans the promise of where we're going, utopia. That's communism. It is a utopian vision, a communal societal vision. It's utopia outside of God. It is, and for those of you that are biblically familiar, it's the millennial kingdom without God, is what communism is. It's everything that God promised he's going to bring in one day, only without God. And then Sigmund Freud, who is the great secular psychologist, he helped man deal with human guilt. What do I do with my guilt and my shame? That thing inside of us that tells us that we're morally separated from God, and he brought about the means by which to help people feel right, feel comfortable with who they were, and not to feel separated from God like the Bible teaches. Again, we can argue about the validity of Darwin or of Marx or of Freud as it relates to their theories. All I'm saying is all three of them, what they did is they spat in the face of the biblical model. We can agree or disagree about the biblical model, but that's what they did. And so this trifecta that was established well by the early 20th century of prophets established an entire worldview, an entire system that did not need God to function. And this is a fairly rare thing in Western civilization, considering that Western civilization was built upon deities and then eventually became Catholic and was dominated by the Catholic Church until the Reformation, was still dominated by biblical thinking, really until the 19th century. So humanism is what came out of this. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pick up with humanism next time, because I want to respect your time, and I want to let Jeff have a little bit of time here, and then for us to talk a little bit about community too. So we're probably going to go a little bit over either way, but next time I'm going to start talking about the other worldview, this worldview that came into being through Darwin, Marx, and Freud, and where it came from, and what it proposes, and how it is that if we live in a system, and we do, that is dominated by a humanistic worldview, and communism is one part of that humanistic worldview, Marxism. If you live in that system, and we do, the founding documents don't make any sense. They don't reflect the reality that our young people have in their heads. And because of that, it is our job not just to go to a school board meeting and to fight for what we want. Now, that's right and that's good, because they're supposed to work for us. And to get them, get the ones that don't work for us out of there and put in people that do work for us. And that's right and that's good too. But can you start to see, even though we've not gotten into humanism really yet, can you start to see how if we just do that, we're still going to lose? We're still going to lose if that's all we do. Because the minds of the people are, if they don't have a worldview that regards the basic tenets of the Word of God as true, then they will not come to the conclusion that the founding documents make sense. They won't. They can't. And that's where we're going with this. Now, I'm going to wrap it up there. I'm sorry that we couldn't finish. But that's where we're headed next. And what I hope to equip you with over these many months, in our singular month meetings, will be to equip you with the resources necessary to contend for your worldview. First, to establish your worldview, and then to contend for it. And to stop contending just for the little nitty-gritty top-level stuff, which it's fine to contend for, but when you're trying to change things, to bring about restoration, it's got to come as people are actually brought to an understanding and an agreement with the principles that God has laid out in the Scriptures. That's the only way it's going to happen. And if we don't do that, well, then we'll be coming to a day when the founding documents simply aren't relevant to the people any longer. And they will be cast off, and they will be cast off with applause, because they do not reflect the worldview of the people of this country anymore. And that's what we are contending to reverse. But we've got to do it by understanding these things.